Was Napoleon a man of the Enlightenment, and basically kind of focusing on how Napoleon manages to rise to power and winds up ruling France when the French had just fought this massive revolution to overthrow a dictator, which they believed the king was. So the first question is, why did the French consider Napoleon a hero? So a little bit about Napoleon. So he wasn't even really technically French. He was from an island called Corsica, which is off the coast of Italy, which had really been a part more of Italy. It only recently had become part of France. In fact, his name would have been pronounced Bonaparte, much more Italian pronunciation than Bonaparte. So a little bit about him. He becomes a general at a very young age because of all the wars that France was fighting with all these various different countries. It made it possible for Napoleon to rise very quickly through the ranks of the of the French, military. He was most known basically for the Italian campaigns that he took part in earlier in his career. So between 1796 to 1797, he conquered most of northern Italy for France, and then he actually started governing the area. In northern Italy, he moved to suppress religious orders and serfdom and limit age-old noble privilege. So he kind of became a pretty popular figure in France because of him conquering those areas. In Italy, I think I showed you this painting in AP World, the painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps, kind of triumphantly, leading the French army into Italy to take it over. Some of his other earlier military campaigns was the Egyptian campaign, in which he manages to discover, or not he personally, but one of his troops managed to discover the Rosetta Stone, which is why now linguists can figure out how to read ancient hieroglyphics. But actually, in 1798, he was defeated by the British Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson, who destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. So basically, this was a disaster because the French army was really kind of like trounced. So he abandons his troops, returns to France to receive a hero's welcome. He basically leaves his troops behind because he wants to get ahead of the story. He wants to be able to get back to France before the story really gets out about how badly his defeat was in Egypt. So to not tarnish his stellar reputation, because like I said, he was so popular and having conquered this other areas in France, for France, I should say. So just to kind of show you around the time Napoleon is going to come to power, this is the map of Europe. So we can see the new states throughout Italy that were established by the French. You can see the islands of Corsica, which is where Napoleon was originally from. But the next question is, why did the Directory need Napoleon to help govern? So the Directory, as we know from the other day, was not really going very well. The war was going badly for the French at this point. The Directory was pretty much corrupt, and they were having a hard time ruling. And the Directory wanted a change in government. They wanted a stronger government. And they figured Napoleon, who was young, he was in his 30s, would be a good person to kind of help basically form a coup and take over the French government on their behalf. So with the government in disarray because the Directory is not really very effective, he stages a coup d'etat on November 9th, 1789, also known as the coup of Brumaire, because remember they had changed all the dates, all the months. He proclaims himself first consul. There were supposed to be 3 councils. So this was going to be referred to as the consulate. And their new republic was created. Napoleon gets himself, like I said, named first consul. Then eventually, once he has that title, he makes himself consul for life. And then he eventually proclaims himself emperor. And he basically does away with the elected assembly and sets up an appointed Senate instead. So we see that he pretty quickly starts making power grabs in order to control the country. Like I said, a relatively short period of time. So in the government of the consulate, there was supposed to be a council of state that proposed the laws, and they served as a cabinet and the highest court. Then you have the tribunate, who debated laws but did not vote on them. Then you had a legislature that voted on the laws but did not discuss or debate them. And then he had a Senate, which had the right to review and veto legislation. So he purposefully kept the process of lawmaking, he purposefully kept it very, very divided up. So you have one body that proposes the law, one body that can debate the law that they didn't even write. So they don't write the law, the tribunate, they just get to debate the merits of the law. And then they pass that on to the legislature and they get to vote on it, but they never wrote the law and they never debated the law. And then the Senate has the right to review the law. So we see that this is incredibly, the power is distributed amongst all these various different organizations, basically making sure that one organization does not have too much power, and that really his position is the only position that really has any power in this situation. So one of the things Napoleon did though in 1800 was establish the Bank of France. Now, so basically, in 1799, he is going to dissolve the republic and create himself and create an empire. So why did the people accept this? Like, they spent all this time fighting. Why, in the end, did they accept Napoleon coming to power? He basically is an authoritarian. It's an authoritarian regime that's going to wind up ruling France from 1799 until 1814. But he did keep some elements of a democracy, and in doing that, kind of placated the people. But the main thing he was able to do is he was able to end all the strife in France. Now, if you remember, they went through the Reign of Terror, and then you have the chaos of the Directory, and he was seen as being able to create order. And after all of the disorder of the French Revolution that people had been experiencing going back to 1789, so now this is like 10 years of political disorder, the people just wanted stability, and they were willing to trade their rights for stability. He also makes a lot of agreements with, powerful groups, and he grants a lot of favors for loyal service. So people were willing to support him because they were rewarded very handsomely by Napoleon. Now, going back to this idea that he creates this very decentralized government that's kind of just all this power is distributed, all of these positions were elected by universal male suffrage. So for a lot of the people that never had the chance to vote, because even under the Constitution of 1791, remember, only a very small percentage of the population can vote, a lot of people were like, oh, I can vote. That's cool. They didn't necessarily understand that their ability to vote for all these different, the council, state, tribunate, legislature, and Senate was diluted by a system of indirect voting, who basically voters who chose representatives, who then chose off of a list of representatives, and then Napoleon basically had the final say. But the fact that these people were able to actually physically go and vote, to some people, they didn't necessarily understand that their vote was so diluted. They were happy with it. So they were happy with the stability. They were happy with the glory that Napoleon brought to the French country because of his military success. And they were happy with the fact that they felt like they had the right to vote. It was enough. Is Napoleon upholding the ideals of the revolution? So what is he actually doing that in any way, shape, or form could be considered, following the ideas of the revolution? So he basically created a government that depended on him, was appointed by him and depended upon him. But much of his legal and administrative reorganization has survived to this day. And again, he gave order and stability combined with military victory and reawoken a sense of French nationalism. He did use the plebiscite quite often. So the plebiscite is a vote of the people. So sometimes, like when you guys are old enough to vote, you'll vote for candidates, but then sometimes there'll also be like referendums or different ballot issues or initiatives that might be on the ballot that you can vote either yes or no for rather than it going to the legislature. That's basically a plebiscite. And he used that quite often. So again, the people felt like their thoughts and needs were being consulted. Now, of course, the plebiscite was racked with voter fraud. Turns out most of the time the actual vote was more than the actual turnout. And Napoleon really wasn't a man who believed that people had the ability to rule. He said liberty is a need felt by a small class of people. Therefore, it must be repressed with impunity. So, it's a mixed bag. He was willing to consult the people, but it was more like he was willing to make the people think like they were being consulted. Now, in 1802, he produces a second constitution in which he gives himself the title of consulate for life. And then eventually in 1804, his third constitution, this is number 6 for France if you're counting, he creates a hereditary empire. He reduces the power of that legislature that he created. And on December of 1804, he has this lavish coronation in Notre Dame Cathedral where he crowns himself emperor. He did create, though, a system of education. He established, this was established in 1801 as a form of educational reform. So the lycées, and I'm probably again massacring that French, were initially enrolled in the nation's most talented students. They had to pay tuition, although there was some financial help available for poorer students, and this trained the nation's future bureaucrats. So he did reform the education system. And then he awarded people the Legion of Honor. He actually creates more nobles than like all of the other kings combined. So Louis XVI would name about 10 nobles per year. Napoleon was naming 1 noble per day. And he did this to honor generals and to honor civil servants. And that's kind of a little bit of a controversial, I can't even talk, I'm sorry, controversial idea. Now we know from AP World, in regards to Haitian independence, he tried to take back Haitian independence and he tried to re-enslave the Haitian people. So that's not necessarily very enlightened or revolutionary, because the revolution did free slaves and in France and also in the colonies as well. Some other things that he did, he abolished divorce. And again, like I said, he tried to legalize slavery again. He reestablished the nobility. He censored theaters. He closed newspapers. He controlled all of the printing. So if you wanted to have anything printed in France, it had to be approved by the government. Postmasters would actually open people's mail and take notes for Napoleon to kind of like report back on what people were saying. So, but he was kind of contradictory. At times, he could be very lenient, and at times, he could strike very harshly against his enemies. In fact, he invaded a neutral country once to bring back a member of the royal family. But he did try to reunite France. He welcomed the Embrages back into France. He reestablished the the Catholic Church, made peace with the Catholic Church. And he was very good at managing to gain support from groups that would have been normally very hostile to him. So the next question is, why would Napoleon want to reunite with the church? So why does he make peace with the church? So in 1801, Napoleon makes what's known as the Concordat of 1801. He wanted to heal the divisions within the Catholic Church that had developed over the whole civil constitution of the clergy. But he wanted to use the church and gain the church's support so that the church would prop up his regime and support his regime, which is why the Pope is present when he's crowned emperor. Even though he takes the crown away from the Pope's hand and crowns himself emperor, he still had the church play a prominent role in that ceremony. So he declares Catholicism as the religion of the majority of the French people. The Pope would have to accept the fact that they lost land during the Revolution and they weren't getting it back. The bishops were still having to be subservient to the regime. Eventually, the Pope renounced this, and the Pope actually had him placed under house arrest because Napoleon conquers quite a lot of areas of Europe. But he did also protect the religious freedom of the Protestants and the Jews, and France actually becomes a center of religious tolerance under Napoleon. But he realized also that he needed to try to make some sort of peace with the church. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about today for Napoleon was the Napoleonic Code. Why was the Napoleonic Code a lasting contribution for France? So the Napoleonic Code was issued in 1804. It divides civil law into personal status, property, and the acquisition of property. Its purpose was to reform the French legal code and to reflect the principles of the French Revolution and create one code for France. Because France had a whole host of different legal codes depending on what part of France you were in. They followed a different legal code. So he eliminated all of the old laws, the antiquated laws, standardized the law. So same law across the country. He had detailed laws on private property, protecting people who got land during the revolution. So that meant that the small gains that the peasantry made and that the middle class made were reconfirmed. However, he kind of takes back a lot of the gains that women made under the French Revolution. So he basically treated women as subordinates and blocked their emancipation throughout Europe because he really did not have a very high opinion of women. He felt that their main purpose was to produce children. He wanted to reestablish what he referred to as a family monarchy, where power of the husband was absolute. So he kind of, reconfirmed some ideas of the French Revolution, but then also harmed some people with the ideas of the French Revolution. He does spread the Napoleonic Code to all of the places that he takes over across France, and it is one of his long-lasting contributions. His wife, Josephine, she was an older woman. She had adult children when they got married. She was never able to produce an heir for him. And even though they had kind of this, tumultuous love story, he winds up divorcing her so that he could marry the Austrian princess and, produce children so that he could continue, his reign after he dies. But this is Josephine's bedroom. Again, that's the famous coronation of the Empress Josephine. But in the end, I want you to think about this question. Do you think Napoleon really was a man of the Enlightenment?